Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Do you remember all that chaos and confusion at the beginning of COVID, especially for students having to pivot from in-class learning to then online learning and then sometimes synchronous learning? It was definitely a lot to handle in March 2020. And I suspect that university students and even faculty may have had it the worst. They were just getting ready to wrap up their term, entering final exams, and then poof, no more in-person classes, and quickly things had to pivot. Well, did they pivot well? We're going to talk about that in a moment. But what I'd really like to discuss is, were all these policies necessary? We've seen policy after policy after policy in the past couple of years at universities and colleges. Are they all necessary? And really, how effective are they? Well, joining me today to share his perspective and experience at University of Calgary is Barry Cooper, a professor of political science at the University of Calgary. And he's also an author of Paleolithic Politics and co-author of COVID-19, The Politics of a Pandemic Moral Panic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mr. Cooper.
You're welcome, Tanya.
Excellent. So I have to say that I really enjoyed reading your latest submission to the C2C journal, and it was titled Empire of Fear: How the Pandemic Made a Canadian University Lose Its Mind. It was a real grabbing title. What compelled you to write this?
First of all, I didn't choose the title. I thought the title was chosen by the editor, and I thought it really would get people's attention. The reason why I wrote it is partly it's a microcosm of what my co-author and I, Marco Navarro, wrote in the COVID-19 book. The second edition should be out sometime later this summer. The first edition was finished basically in the fall of 2020, and a lot has happened since then in the next 18 months or so. So we wanted to talk about that as well. But anyway, why did I write this piece for C2C? Well, from the beginning, the university sent out basically a series of emails from the senior administration and from an electronic newsletter that comes out every day, or in the summer, I think 2 or 3 times a week. And I read it, and I was saying to myself, where are these people coming from? Where do they get the content that they send out to every faculty member and every what we call support staff, and I believe every student too? When it struck me as being just quite bizarre, so I started collecting it, and you can see patterns in it. And I thought, well, this would make an interesting thing to write about. Not to single out the University of Calgary. I don't think that USC was any different than almost every other major university in the country in the way they responded to it. So I'm not picking on these people for their being so bizarre. The really interesting question is why, not just the universities, but why did the country behave in the way it did? And then why did the university follow the leads of provincial and the federal government and their quote experts in the health bureaucracy? That's the interesting question.
And you highlighted at the beginning of your piece, you said when the lockdown first happened, again March 2020, there didn't seem to be a surge in cases. So I'll ask you point blank, was there a surge in cases in Calgary, at the University of Calgary, which is your personal experience? Was there a surge in cases warranting a lockdown?
Well, that's the problem that never gets asked. There was a lot of evidence, not just from North America, but obviously from Sweden, which is a great outlier in this whole in the whole political response to the COVID-19 event. Where none of this took place, or very little of it. And in North America, there was a lot of evidence by people who were at least as well credentialed as Dina Hinshaw. I would say much more in terms of their expertise than she ever was, or Ms. Tam in Ottawa, to say nothing of our neighbors in British Columbia. that questioned the whole basis for all of these, what I called involuntary agoraphobia, which is to separate us the way was done.
Welcome back. I'm having a good chat with Barry Cooper on what ensued at universities across this country and across society in general, specifically in his experience at the University of Calgary. Barry Cooper, thank you so much for joining me. Before we went to commercial break, we were discussing the panic that ensued and the immediate lockdown. You used the phrase agoraphobia, that we were turned instantly into an agoraphobic society.
Yeah, and it was completely unnecessary. Normally, people like to get along with one another. They like to talk in person. Certainly, you can't teach undergraduates in particular without actually having them in the class, physically out there in the audience. Seminars, the whole point of a seminar is to have students interacting one with another. All of that became impossible.
And I remember, again, quoting back to your story, and at the beginning, you said there was not one case when the decision was made to lock down. And of course, there were universities that had many cases. Your university, frankly, had not one case, had not one positive case, yet it locked down following lockstep with the rest of the country. At one point, you wrote, the dean seriously told the faculty to, quote unquote, forget all that nonsense about Isaac Newton inventing calculus while at home from Trinity College, Cambridge, due to the plague. Give me a break. And his colleagues at U today had a somewhat different idea. They did not advise reinventing calculus at home, but they did point out that coronavirus isolation is an opportunity to teach boys about toxic masculinity. So this was very interesting. Okay, we'll deal with let's deal with the toxic masculinity. So was this just an opportunity? Well, not just an opportunity, but did some people capitalize on this and say, you know what, here, let's insert some wokeism into this conversation?
Quite frankly, I have no idea. I don't know what the dean was thinking of. It is certainly true, what he said about Isaac Newton. Uh, the people at U today, heaven knows what they possibly could have had in mind. Toxic masculinity is another one of these sort of pseudo terms that has almost zero content to it. In the original version, I said, yeah, they could teach their kids about toxic femininity too. I mean, it makes about as much sense, which is to say none. Um, I, you know, I think, I think the people who wrote that stuff uh, were basically as scared as they wanted everyone else to be, and they really didn't have a clue about what they were suggesting, which is unfortunate if they're supposed to be the leadership of the university.
Well, and universities are places for higher learning where, we expect a lot of scrutiny and a lot of the scientific method employed. Before the break, you were saying that there were many well-credentialed epidemiologists and researchers who said, you know what, perhaps lockdowns aren't the route to go, which ran contrary to some of our own medical officers of health federally, provincially. Do you think things ought to have been handled better? Were we sort of in a glass bowl where we're just listening to each other too much and letting this fear kind of take over?
I think a lot of it is a kind of groupthink that the evidence seems to suggest that all of the senior administrators in universities, and certainly all the bureaucrats in Ottawa and Edmonton and Victoria and elsewhere, uh, seem to think the same thing. Um, Whatever you may think of that, it is certainly not scientific, and it is certainly an abandonment of one of the historical positions that universities have been charged with undertaking, namely to criticize uh, dogma. And this was about as dogmatic as you can get, for which there was a huge amount of contested evidence, which was simply ignored by the bureaucrats, whether they're in the university or in Edmonton.
I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum. On Boom and Bust, what you're going to get are former prime ministers.
It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't mind who gets the credit.
Senior economists.
We need to unleash small businesses.
This is a great country to start a business. It is not a great country to build a business.
Realistically, we have to be a trading nation. That's our history.
I'm very worried about how vulnerable Canada's economy is.
These are the kinds of issues that we tackle at Boom and Bust.
Hi, I'm Sejal Patel, host of Strictly Money. If you're confused about how much fees you're paying on your investments, you'll want to mark your calendar because next week we'll break down the costs and whether you are getting value for your money. Join me Sunday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern.
Welcome back. We're here discussing the university's response to COVID and how that has fared. And joining me is Barry Cooper, who's a professor of political science at the University of Calgary. Barry, you know, it went from lockdown to kind of masking, and then from masking very quickly, things went into vaccine mandates. How were vaccine mandates ushered in your experience?
Well, in that article, I call them vaxes rather than vaccines, because the mRNA, genetic experiments, I don't know quite what to call them, were not the kind of vaccinations that I got when I was a kid. They were, initially it was just suggested, then it was strongly suggested that we all get vaxxed. Then we were exhorted almost interminably, like every day. And then late in the summer of 2021, we were told everybody had to be vaxxed by New Year's Day 2022. And that meant the students couldn't come on campus, they couldn't register, and the professors wouldn't get paid. If that's not coercion, I don't know what is. And as I said in that paper, I wasn't the only person to say this. Of course, there was a guy in the med school actually who, or the Children's Hospital, who pointed this out. It is impossible for anyone in the whole world to give informed consent to being vaxxed because there is insufficient information that you could say, I am informed. You certainly could get enough information to know not to be vaxxed, but you couldn't get enough information to be vaxxed because these things were developed so quickly and so soon, and the data just wasn't there. Now,
you said this very poignant line in your paper that you submitted. Again, this is a recent journal entry you did for the C2C journal. You said by July 2021, a new source of anxiety had come into existence, not being locked out, but returning to campus. And I remember that because this was 1 year ago in the summer. And I remember hearing from so many parents and their children or the students themselves saying that they were anxious to return if they did not have the vaccine, or what it would be like and how would the rapid testing work. And there was a massive anxiety when usually, return to school is a time for joy and celebration and excitement. Here it was a lot of anxiety, as you aptly put. Can you share with us how tangible that anxiety was, and in your experience, how was it for students and faculty? I don't want to ignore the faculty, of course.
Well, interestingly enough, I think my students were pretty happy to get back. At least that's what they said, and I have no reason to doubt them. Among my colleagues, I'm not so sure. I suppose if you're afraid, which seems to be the main purpose of both the government and the university's instructions, then you have a lot of anxieties about coming back onto in this case, the 7th floor of the social science building. And during the whole time, there were, let's say there are 20 some odd people in the department. I only ran into, on a regular basis, 2 or 3. And that said to me that the rest of these people have either adjusted, they'd rather work at home, work on Zoom, or they're just, scared. And I have no idea which, but It's certainly no way to run a university, and it certainly also destroyed whatever integrity the political science department had.
Well, and it's interesting, again, I've spoken to so many professors and medical experts in this field and researchers, but I haven't spoken to a political science professor on their observation. And I studied political science at university, and it's a very interesting discipline. And so you get to kind of step back and see the politics in all of this. And there's been a lot of complaints that there was an over-politicization of this virus and the response to it. Would that be a fair assessment, that there's been a lot of politics in dealing with COVID?
Yeah, and it's the worst kind of politics. It's bureaucratic politics. One of the reasons why these medical bureaucrats did not look at the alternative explanations and the evidence that contradicted their positions was that they did not want to discuss a lot of things. They simply wanted people to obey. Uh, that's not sort of normal politics, and it certainly is something that a lot of people in this university found really very unpleasant.
We're going to come to commercial break, but I think, we really have to discuss, what state does this leave our higher learning institutions in? How does this leave our universities and our colleges? We're going to continue this discussion in just a few moments. Hi, welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion with Barry Cooper, a professor of political science at the University of Calgary and author of a C2C journal paper, Empire of Fear: How the Pandemic Made a Canadian University Lose Its Mind. Very grabbing title. Barry, you mentioned you mentioned many things in this paper. One thing that also stood out is you said the administration supported the growth of an authoritarian biopolitical security state in service to which citizens were treated as children and denied any expected charter protections. This authoritarian biopolitical security state, expand on that, please.
Well, when you have medical officers of health telling you can't leave your house, and when it's enforced by the local police, when it's enforced by your employer, that's a different kind of regime than most of us are used to. There's been a lot of research on surveillance and medical surveillance, the QR codes and so on, and how this enables governments initially, but also the people who provide the electronic services to know where you are. And there's a lot of concern about that. Whether or not the government of Alberta, in this case, the government of Canada, capitalizes on lessons learned on how they can surveil their populations and how they can control them, I think remains to be seen. But in the transportation sector, you can see the government of Canada has done very little to reduce what they thought and said anyway were necessary measures. The evidence that they were necessary, I think, is completely fictitious. That they weren't necessary. They were certainly bureaucratic initiatives. And what that will do to the Canadian population, or even in the microcosm of the university, I really don't know. I don't think it'll be good, though.
So, in hindsight's always 2020, and we're going to look back, and hopefully there'll be some kind of royal commission on all these things where we explore what was done poorly, terribly, and what could have been handled better, perhaps. But there are some students and faculty who I'm sure were actually very concerned with COVID. And I know the universities have an obligation, definitely a legal obligation, to provide, a safe environment. How do you think things could have been handled differently to, give that balance and perhaps so that, these mistakes or this overhanded bureaucratic approach doesn't happen again?
Well, you remember, or maybe you don't, I certainly remember, in March, it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve. 2 weeks. Okay, you give them 2 weeks. And then what happened? Then it was 2 more weeks, and then it was like 18 months. And what they could have done, I would say, as I mentioned earlier, is the great outlier is Sweden, which is you didn't have to do anything. You had to do very little. And the epidemiology, at least I'm not an epidemiologist, but there seems to be pretty much a consensus that lockdowns and masking and so on is not the way you deal with epidemics. And pandemics are just big epidemics. There's all kinds of things that could have been done. This institution could have resisted the government of Alberta's insistence on masking, and they could have cited evidence at the time, not 6 months later. At the time, there was evidence that it was useless, but they didn't. And for that reason, I said that they lent themselves to being complicit in this more, let's say, repressive way of dealing with a medical problem.
We only have about 40 seconds left. So how does that leave the state of our Canadian universities if, as it seems you're suggesting, there was a lack of critical thinking or proper scientific analysis of data, or just analysis of any data for that matter, when these kinds of policies were being enforced? We send children and students and adults even to university for higher learning, to be our future leaders. What hope should we have for universities if this is how they respond in this circumstance? 10 seconds.
Yeah, that's it. If we're lucky, next time we'll remember what the vocation of a university is. We sure blew it this time.
Okay. Barry Cooper, thank you so much. I really appreciate your insights, and congrats on the books.
Thank you.
Could things have been handled differently at universities? Sounds like it. Will they be handled differently the next time? I hope so. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.